Hello. All right. So I just had a little bit of a run in with my own technology and got triggered right before this live. So welcome back to another episode, another rant of how to align with transformation. This one, I think, I've been busy this May. If you've been following me, I have had a collision of my two worlds of like, and I live my life off camera, honestly, because I think that's what, we need to do to take care of our mental health a lot. Not everything needs to be posted on social media, but because social media is a tool and a resource for business, I, share my life. So my two worlds of like modeling and my professional clinical social work have officially combined themselves this month. And I'm like, oh, okay, so here we go. But how to align with transformation is definitely more of my professional identity. And I have been working towards how to merge those two identities of how taking care of myself and modeling is part of that, is me taking care of myself and living my life, because in order for me to help other people, I have to be a healthier person. So May, I have had a fashion show. April, I had another fashion show. And then last weekend, I did my third year at Creativerse. So I'm going to do a whole post and reflection about that. But today it's time to get back into the normal routine of, what are some of the things that, how I transformed my life, the little topics of things that and help people and other people transform their life and their mental health. And today, honestly, it's kind of more for healthcare providers, but I think other people will be able to get something from it, because what's fundamental, this is really going to be me having an opinion. I'm going to be calling out some people too. I don't think my message may or may not be liked, but we're going to be talking about moral injury and the health of healthcare. I'm going to kind of keep it somewhat on healthcare, but before I do that, I want to talk about like what moral injury is and why is it important for people to understand it, as, if you're trying to understand this mental health thing. So I probably should pull up the definition, but I'm going to just give you guys can Google it. What is moral injury? But I'll give you an example of what it is. But let me give you the actual definition. That's where we can use AI a little bit. So, but moral injury, before I give you the textbook definition, I started learning about in my career when I started taking trainings on PTSD. And PTSD, we can generally make a diagnosis of PTSD with any kind of traumatic event, but it is most common from the perspective of military. When we deal with military veterans, we see a lot of people put in a position where they have to be injurious to their main morals and their values. And so I realized this because I don't work with veterans. And the reason why I don't is because it hits a little bit too close to home. My brother is a veteran, and I have had personal encounters with him as to like overstepping my boundaries. And honestly, he was right to put me back in my lane because my worry about his safety. My brother is my only, relatable male figure. I have brothers in the sense of like spiritual family, but he is my one and only brother, and he is a all-in military man. And so when I started learning in my profession about moral injury, I was like, okay, well, since I don't work with veterans, like how can I use this information in my life? And I realized it was a significant part of how civilians need to understand the impact of not only having a potential military person in your family and what they may be subjected to, but how does that actually affect your reality and your mental health? Because a lot of the times, and even if you don't have someone in military, we're all exposed to someone who has had to potentially be in a moral injury situation. So as an example, moral injury looks like because of the role that you serve, you have to do something that you don't agree with. So in the context of the military, this is potentially having to hurt someone else because of a potential threat to something else that has impact. I'm not necessarily going to give a specific example. I think y'all can honestly kind of comprehend. And if you can't understand what I'm saying, then That's fine. You don't really need to understand that example. What really we need to look at is, how does a person overstep their own morals and values, and what kind of impact does that have on cognition and perception of themselves? That's pretty much what moral injury means. So actual definition, which I'm just going to kind of pull, there's lots of words. But moral injury is the distressing psychological, behavioral, social, and sometimes spiritual aftermath to exposure to events that contradict deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So I honestly think this just this one thing. If you have an overactive mind like I do, you could be like, oh, moral injury, moral injury, moral injury, moral injury. Because yes, there is a degree of that in honestly everything we do. I stay somewhat aligned with my values, but sometimes I step out and I value sustainability. I went to cookout last night. That's not really eating sustainably all the time, but it's like, but is that a big moral injury? No, but we have to be very careful and mindful about all the different areas in our life where moral injury becomes something that we are more tethered to and actually carry out in our behaviors. And because it starts to put the brain in a very, very tight space. And what I mean by tight space is certain parts of the brain start to shut down because it's causing stress in our bodies emotionally, because we instinctively and subconsciously are driven by our morals and our values. So if we are overstepping those particular bounds and not addressing the emotional and or physical spiritual stress that we're enduring, that is where we start to see chronic illness in terms of like depression, anxiety. You let those go unnoticed, that starts to become physical chronic illness, and so on. So how do you know if moral injury is something that you could possibly pay attention to in your life? Guilt and shame. If you struggle with guilt and shame, which I did for a long time, and I still do, but now it's because I've ultimately kind of cleaned out a lot of my internal and stuff, and I've reorganized everything for myself. Guilt and shame now become my indicators of where I'm like, oh, I'm out a little bit too far, or I need to consider, what is this purpose or what is this intention behind me doing something that is fundamentally against what my values and my perception, what I stay grounded in, okay? So I wouldn't say this is a place for people to start, but I feel like I wanted the general public, if anyone comes across this video at some point, to be able to understand this is a potential perspective that you might want to consider, reflecting on. Where does guilt and shame come up for you? Where does it, and what is it telling you about this, right? This is something I talk about. I don't always use the term moral injury, but I do educate my clients about it, is that when, especially so I see this often in relationships, especially earlier parts on people like dating, and is that because we're not trained, and even including me, because I still have more training I can do, but the majority of us, we've never received that accountability and that training at like an educational level to be attuned to ourselves, that we miss ultimately what guilt and shame are telling us about where we stand in alignment to our values. And that is ultimately why I even have the name of, my podcast being How to Align with Transformation. You're never going to be spot on in transformation at all point in times. You have to find an alignment to it, because life is going to bring you out of the bounds because you can't control it. So how do you stay generally knowing where those bounds are? That's your emotions. In a world of invisible, I finally have had my time where it's like, I knew I was an emotional creature for a reason. For the longest time, it really was a pain in the ass. But I finally realized, like, guilt and shame, those are your moral indicators. So if you are turning your brain off, be like, emotions, nope, I'm not angry, denial. If you hear denial in your vocabulary of someone else's perception of you, or your perception of someone has of you, then that's where it's going to get a little bit sticky. And that's where chronic mental health issues are going to ultimately form, right? But why am I talking about this, right? I want to zoom out to the healthcare system, because this is where I said at the beginning, I got something to say, and people may or may not like it, but here it is. It's still got to be said. The healthcare system, and especially certain roles in the healthcare system, actively are in moral injurious positions. I'm not going to say it's every single person I'm about to list off, but I'd say from my observation, because I have been in these systems, I've been in inpatient hospitals, I've been in regular medical hospitals versus psychiatric hospitals, I've been in private hospitals, but in outpatient, is that certain positions in our healthcare system are affected by moral injury. The first one that has the potential highest risk factor are going to be your doctors. Doctors potentially, because, and here's, it's not because if you are a doctor, you're morally injurious. No, people pursue being a doctor for different reasons, okay? But if you are not intentional, like some people just want to be a doctor because it's like, oh, you make money. I'd say that's a higher risk, because what's going to happen is when you get into an industry, every industry has multidisciplinary intersections for people. But healthcare, you have pharma, big pharma, and then you also have the actual hospital system, which has to operate as a business. Each certain part of those exposures to each other's business structure potentially compromise why a doctor goes into healthcare. And especially because when you get into a hospital system like that, and I think, you know, since COVID, I've seen a lot of healthcare providers start trying to stay out of healthcare systems, myself included, and that can have its cause and effect. But not every doctor can leave the hospital, but they have higher risk of practicing outside of their moral values because of the resistance and the business structure of what healthcare is. Now, I don't think this is just my gut feeling. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. Honestly, time will tell. But I don't think it's going to stay that way forever, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere unless each individual person understands and is intentional about finding some way to resist and or disconnect from the stress that it is to be in a moral injurious position. And so what I mean by that is that if you're in a position where you can't leave a hospital structure, you're going through clinicals, you need to have something that is counteracting and holding you accountable to filling your cup, metaphorically, emotionally, more on the outside of those hospital, like in those business structures, to combat the emotional aftermath and the spiritual aftermath of having to make decisions that you don't necessarily agree with. And I see this often because I ultimately, before I actually owned being, you know, the provider for providers, a lot of my private practice clients, because of just physical location of where my office was, this is, you know, pre-COVID, but also a little bit during COVID, they were healthcare professionals. I end up seeing a lot of nurses and doctors because they are the number one people who are exposed to being in positions where you have to just do the surgery, whether you agree with there could be preventable and preventative strategies that have to be done. And sometimes you just have to show up and do what you're told to do. So this in a micro form can also be experienced in the general public too, because I know I have my own personal experience with it, is working in a private hospital, a psychiatric hospital, where the difference, so my heart has always been in like community, holistic space before I even knew that. And I was tasked as a therapist, right? I'm there to do assessments, lead groups, all that stuff. I'm now tasked with having to tell a patient who does not have insurance and who had to come in and detox from, you know, their life that you could judge as to be like, oh, they're, you know, strain on the system, da da da. I'm not going to go there right now. But I had to go tell this patient that they had to pack their bags in the middle of detoxing and go down the street to the state-funded hospital because they didn't have insurance. Your girl that didn't sit well with me. It really didn't. And this was also during a time where I was actually pretty quiet, but I also, hindsight, start to see this is why I did not last very long in systems where the process and the procedure was already set. And I said, okay, well, if I have to do this, I pulled my supervisor in with me. I'll stand next to you while you say it, but I'm not saying it. I refuse to, I negotiated in a way because I knew that I couldn't just say no. Like, this is where, as much as boundaries as I teach, boundaries are not about just saying no. They're saying about what you can do. So you stay and protected from situations as much as possible where your morals and values are compromised. So what happened was, instead of me going to tell this client or this patient that, hey, you're in the middle of a detox process, we got to get you packed up, you got to go down to, I'm not going to say which hospital because it's actually not even in running anymore. You got to go down the street because essentially this hospital is not willing to pay for your stay anymore. So I said, okay, supervisor, totally respect that that's what has to be done. Hold on, let me mute these. I totally respect that that's what has to be done, but I would like you to be standing next to me, and I will be present while you say that. I, at that point, would never have considered myself an assertive person. I was just kind of going with the flow. I just knew, like, I was just, a detox therapist. But hindsight, I look like, oh, that was me resisting moral injury, because I am not the person who's going to say, hey, because you are not paying something, because you are not, aesthetically pleasing to look at, means that you have to get out of my way. Now, I don't roll that way, but I'm also, I don't know, different, whatever you want to say. At that point in time, I didn't see that in myself, and that's okay. But hindsight, when I started doing a lot of my reflection of like, okay, well, how does moral injury show up in my life? I realized it was in those certain circumstances of my past that I had the choice as to whether or not I was going to do something that I believed in or something that I didn't believe in. And so when you start to look at your mental health, you kind of, it can be hard, which is why I tell people don't necessarily always go straight back to the reflection, practice the mindfulness first, but you have to consider how the past lives within you, is that how are you going to bring those particular lessons that you may or may not have been able to really understand and benefit from at the time and use them to your benefit now. That's why fundamentally I am, and I ventured out past that point to try to even prove my own perspective of like why my values are rooted in sustainability, is I challenged my morals and values before, and I was humbled. Like, innately, you cannot spiritually go past a certain point of who you are. And if you do, that's where the chronic illness, the addictions, the substance issues, the isms start to come in, and fear takes your driver's seat. And where we get stuck in survival mode is because we haven't necessarily started to design our path to make us feel like we actually have choices. And so that's just one example for my life. So this is where I'm going to bring it up a notch to healthcare. So I've already mentioned that the people in the healthcare system who are most susceptible to this, unfortunately, just by default, are doctors. I see it so often because of the other corporate style things, which, to be honest with you, I don't think healthcare is going to go anywhere, but we have to continue learning and redesigning from past mistakes, that it can't be all about insurance billing. And honestly, it may not be able to be all free either, even though I do believe that's a fundamental human right. You come onto this earth given the responsibility to be yourself and have to learn health. It shouldn't be a bill. It shouldn't be an extremely significant, huge investment for people. However, it does have to be an investment. And some of that is financial, but some of it is more like just time. You have to take the time to understand yourself as a health and a being. But I'm getting off point. Healthcare since COVID has been crumbling. And the reason that is, from my perspective, is because it was created with more dependency than it could uphold. And this is why codependency is pretty much my world, is that we're all going to be codependent on each other, but we have not had any limitations built in to actually balance out the dependency issue that comes with codependency. And this is where I'm going to bring another term into place. And I see this, again, I'm biased because it's my whole world, but is another term is called learned helplessness. The healthcare profession as in whole, and we're all if you're a healthcare provider at any level, whether you're a social worker, a doctor, a nurse, an administrator, is that if you are not actively working to change the systems, not only from within, but also your health as part of the systems that you're trying to change, then we are all a little bit, I'm not going to say guilty, but we're all responsible for the dependency that the healthcare profession has caused the public to be dependent on. So this is where I'm like, it is at the crux of healthcare and why healthcare systems are deteriorating. Emergency rooms are at an all-time high rates of not only the cases that are coming in, but people only go to the doctor when there's a problem. That's one form of dependency. They're over-reliant on physicians, primary care people to understand how to take care of themselves. And now I'm not saying my profession is the answer, but it is the missing link, is that if you do not understand how your brain and your emotions and your mind-body connection works, you will not be able to keep up with the deterioration of your body. Your body is really the only thing that starts to ultimately work against you after a certain point of time. I learned this lesson quite quickly when I don't really think it had anything to do with the age, but it definitely had to do with the timing of when I got an injury at 30. And I used to be able to pop back up and be like, okay, I'm going to do my rest, but I'm also going to keep going. I was humbled, and I was just really humbled. But I also realized it just made me so much aware of like, oh, my body, into how I'm working it, right? And at that point, I was just getting back into some degree of a physical movement conditioning, but I was still focused on my relationship with food. I hadn't really mastered that yet. And I started realizing like, oh, one injury affects your whole body, and it affects your brain too, because of learned helplessness. And I remember when I first learned this term back in school, and I was like, oh yeah, learned helplessness, until it hit me square in the face, where I was like, pain is the one thing that teaches us that we don't feel good, that we feel less than, we feel incapable. And that is the one thing also in my world, in my profession, that is the one thing that tells us we're alive. But if you do not know how to manage pain, then you are going to be completely sideswiped by learned helplessness, because pain tells us a lot of times where our limits are, but how we manage pain is how we expand our limits. I know it's tricky, but really it comes down to the problem has to be part of the solution. Pain cannot be something that we avoid. Pain is what tells us, hey, we're here and alive. Pay attention to ourselves. So if you've watched my other videos on acronyms and how it intersects into this mental health concepts, I create acronyms to help people kind of reposition themselves to understand their experiences. So for example, the word fine, everyone comes in, yeah, I'm fine. And I'm like, fine equals forgot I need to experience. So pain is pay attention inwardly now. I just pretty much came up with the rest of that. I got pay attention last week, and then I just finished it up today. But is that pain is telling us, hey, come back here. Pay attention to I right now. And if we are constantly seeing pain as a limitation, now I'm not saying ignore it. I'm actually saying pay attention to it, but we have to pay attention to where it's coming from and to be able to understand how that influences how we believe ourselves. An example of this is, I'm gonna get some heat for this one, but I'm gonna do it anyway. PMS, women. There are a lot of things that men need to do to change, but there are a lot of things that we need to do as women to better understand our lived experience that repairs and heals relationships between other people. I won't make it just a gender thing. PMS is one of those things that I think is a significant learned helpless situation that women often go through. I remember my first attempt at trying to manage PMS when I was probably like 16 or 17. I remember I was hanging out with my stepmom, and I was like, the cramps were just, I was sitting, I just wanted to curl in, and I was like, I was just irritable. And we tried Midol. Midol was like gasoline to a fire. And that hindsight is really where I realized that the answers are within. So it's also, it took a couple years, but that's why I'm trying to shorten, and be more efficient for everyone else, is that our breath work is the number one pain management tool that we have. That's why your lungs come with you everywhere. But if you're not training your brain to know how to regulate your emotions and your reactions to pain, then that is ultimately where a lot of these chronic, like that's where PCOS stems from. If you get painful periods, if you are chronically emotionally stressed, your menstrual cycle is going to be the first sign that something is going on, and it's not just physical, it's here. Now, breath work is not going to be the only solution, but it is going to be what helps kind of take your foot off the accelerator that pain puts your foot on and makes you think that you can't take off. And that's where learned helplessness comes in, is that if you've been modeled, and honestly, a lot of this has to do with our parents and our mothers modeling this, or if you didn't grow up with a mother, then honestly, you just didn't have the accountability to actually prepare for how you need to living with the fact that we have a menstrual cycle that comes every 28 days, I think. But you can also pick up some really bad habits about not being able to do anything. So for example, if you experience PMS and pain, I'm getting hot because I'm talking too much. If you experience PMS and pain, one of the natural things to do is rest. But we have endorphins and norepinephrine and adrenaline that also help us manage pain. There's a reason that when survival mode is a good thing to understand, because when you get into the gym, that's your natural pain management. And it's not even just the gym. If you go out and walk, your body is managing that pain, and it's actually moving that energy that triggers those emotional associations with pain to actually deal with pain. And it's also regulating nutrients around your body versus staying stagnant and being able to really you have to sit in your suffering. And that's learned behavior. That's learned helplessness in action. Then it expands into how our foods. I know, man, when it is time, the PMS is starting, I start looking at processed foods. These are all old parts of me that I had to filter out. They still live there. I know how to calm my central nervous system enough to get my brain back into my wise mind to think, okay, I really want cookies, chips, ice cream, all the things that I know are going to make me feel like shit the next day. But those things, I compromise with myself. So naturally what your brain does in a state of like pain, it starts going to its reserves of your associations. And this is where going back to psychology at this point, is that from an emotional standpoint, it's trying to help. It's trying to bring you back to places where it's like, oh, see, this was painful, so you need to just stay in bed and you need to rest and you need to avoid, because we don't need to be stressed out right now. You have too much to do. Just stop doing. And what you're not able to really access in terms of information. And some of it is because maybe you weren't taught that, and that's fine. When we don't know something, we can't do something. So now you know, is that we all have our natural pain management in terms of movement and getting yourself, so if you struggle with painful period cramps, doing stretching. It doesn't mean you have to go out for a whole walk and, a whole hike or go to the gym and start lifting really heavy. But I'm just saying, as an example, your body becomes your coping skill. The problem has to be part of the solution. And so as healthcare providers, if you are telling your client to just rest and use a hot water hot water bottle to naturally cope with menstrual cramps, then you are contributing to the overall moral injury of the healthcare profession. I told you, someone's not going to like it. Someone's not going to like what I'm saying, but I think that it's just part of the truth. I'm not big on trying to point out just the problems. I'm trying to focus on the solution. The solution is, number one, getting people to understand that yes, rest is important, but also movement while you're experiencing pain is important. So you don't train your body to think that you can't maneuver or get out of a stressful situation if you're in pain. Because I can guarantee you, if you were in a higher threat situation and you had a broken leg, you'd be trying to get the frig out. Okay, your brain, your bigger reserves of survival mode would come back and be able to literally turn your pain off. And then you would just have to deal with the aftermath, but you would still be alive, right? So we as healthcare providers have to start expanding our vision of like what foods help with pain management. This is really significant because a lot of pain is heightened because of nutrient deficiencies, but mostly pain is the psychological attachments that we have associated with pain. So I just mentioned that more with the like learned helplessness of like, if it's fun, if you've seen this video on social media somewhere, is how pets mimic their people. And someone, like, I think it basically they were on crutches and they were walking around with like a cast on their leg, and their dog started limping too. That's a prime example of just how absorbent and exposed we are to each other, as we can literally feel pain that other people are going through, especially if you consider yourself an empathetic person, which is also why you have to learn how to be able to kind of go into a space and observe what is actually my pain, what is my emotion, right? Because if you were to say like, okay, I have PMS, it's like, okay, how much pain am I really actually in right now? If I do this, let's see, checks and balance, right? If I start stretching, then check in and observe my pain level, what works, what's improving. Now it takes some practice, but that's where like sometimes light stretching, light walking can actually get your body being like, oh, she's going to keep going. She's not necessarily going to just stop here and think that she's helpless and she can't do anything. I'd say that is probably one fundamental area. If you want to work on your mental health and you're especially a woman, is work on how you have adopted learned helplessness in your inheritance. I see this often, especially with women. Like, I don't know. It looks different for everyone. I was having a conversation with a friend today, but we were talking about learned helplessness when it comes to the provider dynamic, the masculine feminine balance relationship dynamic. And I think men can sometimes be a catalyst to women's learned helplessness, which becomes a barrier to a healthy relationship. Because if a woman does not understand and empowerment and self-efficacy, then they're always going to be dependent on that man, and that ultimately now becomes a men's mental health issue, right? So each part of the side of the table needs to work on this concept, but just reflecting of like, okay, it's usually your emotions that are going to indicate where this is with frustration. And this is where this hopefully connects y'all. It's like we were talking about relationships, but is that where do you contribute to not only your own learned helplessness, but the learned helplessness of maybe a partner? That doesn't mean that you need to throw the relationship away. It just means that you need to start slowly figuring out how those contributions can be less and start taking some. And that sometimes is just like, I know some women who refuse to take out the garbage because their man, that's their role. That's eventually going to be, now it's not something I jump on, it's just an example. It's something I jump on later, because it's like, what now happens to your life if that person is not there? If that person goes on a trip, if that person does not last long on this physical earth, how are you prepared to be able to maintain a lifestyle that is actually healthy for you? Because I can guarantee you grief is going to be a bitch if you are not prepared. Because you can't really fully ever be anyways, tangent. Okay, coming back to this is looking at where your learned helplessness is. And I see this let me finish my first example of in the beauty industry. There is a reason, and now me going, into fashion and kind of getting my own exposure, I'm going to be careful about, I'm not trying to hate on anyone's process, because I do think there's a point to having external delegations to people. But if you don't know how to do your own makeup, that's a form of learned helplessness in a way. it is somewhat connected to mental health. It's not just a matter of wearing makeup, but if you feel like makeup is the thing that makes you feel better, then it becomes a learned helplessness of accepting yourself without makeup on. This is why I will never, and I don't really like to say never, because maybe at one point when my purpose is a little bit more fulfilled, I will do this, but I won't ever do permanent makeup for myself. I understand why people do it, but it doesn't necessarily help the overall issue as to why it wants to be done, which is you're not happy with yourself. But this is one way I'm going to resist, and I emulate a model mental health within whatever I do, is I take the time to learn how to do my own makeup, because if I ever need, I don't have to go try to find a makeup artist to be able to help me live my life. Now I see the efficiency in permanent makeup, but that's also, again, why I won't do it. And as one form of mindfulness in my life is anything that I do on a permanent basis, my brain categorizes as something more efficient. And so this is just making reference to my other video of ADHD is an efficiency processing issue, is that we have started to think fast, do fast, and consolidate to the point where we burn out quicker because we don't actually take the time to learn how to slow down, regulate, and be able to actually build our minds sustainably. Now, there are other things within ADHD that also are influenced. It's not just about, but that's just one perspective and example of how efficiency is literally not being addressed, and it's creating the mental health crisis that we're in. And it's also giving a very warped perception, not only of self, but a warped perception of what the actual facts are. Because the facts of my industry is that I'm absolutely okay with people learning about what ADD and ADHD is, but it doesn't actually mean that it's a true diagnosis. Stress can mimic the same characteristics and symptoms that ADHD does for people long term. I think most people, in the tricky part is that your brain is self-protecting. So it will literally be like, oh, too much stress. It's trying to be helpful, remember? So it would literally, as soon as you feel stress, it will sometimes also turn off that stress because it knows that you still have to go do things that you want to do. So then that's really where it's like, if you are hearing denial in your language of like, oh, I don't need to deal with that. Oh, no, that's not happening. Denial has a purpose because it can't deal with everything at once. But pay attention to that, because that is really where we start to have a mental health issue and the facts start to get warped, is that not everyone has an ADHD mind. I do believe that we have sped up. We have sped up through generations, but through my generation specifically, since we started experiencing international crises of a pandemic, where it put an immense amount of stress and a lot of change right on people's front doors. And we have not given people the information and the support to understand how to deal with that. Starting with the fact that stress is a decent, good thing in our lives, but if it is reacted to poorly, it is going to be a bad thing. But, okay. I think I have to leave it there because I'm at like 38 minutes of my rant, and I just think the message can get diluted after this point. Consider where your moral injury, and your guilt and shame tell you where moral injury shows up in your life. You don't just have to be a veteran with, war experience, but if you are exposed to one, that's potentially something that you do need to be prepared for as like a partner or spouse, even a sister, is how that person's trauma affects you in supporting them. But then also take a little bit deeper as where are the things where learned helplessness shows up in your life, where you hear yourself like, oh, I can't do that without this. It's usually wrapped around a condition that reinforces a dependency on something outside of yourself to feel peace. So hopefully there's some decent takeaways and reflections in there for y'all. But that's where I'm going to be, and I'm going to call out healthcare providers to do this work more, because the natural state of healthcare is just we're dependent on, and that's okay. But it also can be burdensome if you are not doing your own personal life work to manage your emotional stress and how stress shows up in your life, and start to be able to kind of reduce the amount of responsibility that we have to that overall global issue. Global. That's the word I was looking for. Global crises of what mental health is. So it is Friday. It's also a really nice Friday, at least in North Carolina where I'm at. Is like a high of 67 and sunny. This is my time to get outside. It's going to be got to do a little work and then get outside. But I hope you guys have a great weekend. I am looking at trying to get back into my routine of every week and every Friday. So keep a lookout for that. But please, go over my YouTube. If you follow me on Facebook, go over my YouTube and like, subscribe, share, so you get notified of when I am going live and talking about these topics. And if you really, I'm going to include this. In terms of the reflection, is not only just looking at those things that I said, but if you are a writer or journaler of your thoughts, which I would encourage people to do, can you type them out? Yes, but I would encourage you to get off the screen and get back to the paper. Start asking yourself these 3 questions. When you're breathing and listening to this narrative and rant that I do, what comes up for you? Is it guilt, shame? Does your heart race? What is happening to you? Write that down. The second question I would ask you is, what does that reaction tell you about what you want to feel? How do you want to feel if that is a negative feeling? How do you observe that, and what do you want from that observation? Those are the first 2 questions. And the third question is, what are you willing to, or what can you do, or what are you willing to do that you're in control over to get to how you want to feel? Okay. Can I repeat that? No, but hopefully you can replay back this particular, those 3 questions for yourself, and, write those thoughts out, because once you put it out in front of you, you have more of an ability to be able to fine tune one next best step to get you out of the general perception that you're stuck in these days. So I will see you next week. Let me know if you guys have any topics or questions you want me to address, because I can keep making them up, but they're gonna be big concepts. So just let me know what you guys want in the comments, and I will do my best to get that for you. So have a great day.